A mother can survive hunger, but watching her child starve is a pain no war can measure. Germany, May 1945. The guns had fallen silent, but silence brought no comfort to the streets of Kassel. It carried a different sound now, the slow shuffle of empty feet across broken cobblestones, the hollow cough of exhausted men, the quiet sobs of children whose tears had long outlasted their strength. The smoke that once climbed into the gray sky had begun to fade, yet another enemy had settled over the city with far greater patience. Hunger did not arrive with explosions. It arrived one skipped meal at a time. It lingered in abandoned kitchens, in cracked cupboards, in bakeries whose brick ovens had gone cold months before. Anna Keller wrapped her faded wool coat tighter around herself as a chilly morning breeze slipped through shattered windows and roofless buildings. She was 28 years old, though the mirror she had left behind before the war would never have recognized the woman she had become. Her blonde hair, once carefully braided every morning, now rested beneath a worn scarf stained with dust from streets that no longer resembled the city where she had grown up. In her arms rested 4-year-old Lucas, his small body frighteningly light against her chest. He had stopped asking for breakfast 2 mornings ago. Children learned quickly when questions only made their mothers cry. His blue eyes wandered across the empty street, watching adults move with the same slow determination as shadows searching for sunlight. Somewhere nearby, a church bell rang. It sounded strangely untouched, as if it belonged to another world where families still gathered around warm tables and fresh bread cooled beside open windows. Anna lowered Lucas onto his feet, brushing dirt from his tiny coat before taking his hand. His fingers were cold despite the spring air. They joined a line of weary civilians stretching nearly half a block outside what had once been the town administrative building. Rumors had traveled faster than certainty. American soldiers had established a temporary relief station somewhere beyond the square. Some claimed flour had arrived overnight. Others whispered there would only be canned soup. Most people no longer cared what the food looked like. Hope itself had become nourishment. The line barely moved. An elderly man leaned heavily on a walking stick carved from an old fence post. A young woman held an infant wrapped inside a blanket much too thin for the morning chill. No one spoke above a whisper. Hunger stole conversations long before it stole lives. Anna glanced toward the square where olive-drab trucks stood beneath fluttering American flags. Soldiers moved with calm efficiency, carrying wooden crates from one vehicle to another. Their boots echoed against broken pavement, their voices unfamiliar but steady. Months earlier, she would have lowered her eyes and hurried away, carrying years of fear shaped by rumors and propaganda. Today, she only saw men unloading food. Lucas tugged gently at her sleeve. His voice was barely louder than the wind. "Mama, does bread still smell the same?" Anna swallowed before answering. She wanted to tell him yes. She wanted to promise warm crusts, soft centers, butter melting into fresh slices like mornings from another lifetime. Instead, she squeezed his little hand and looked toward the American soldiers unloading another crate into the growing sunlight. Somewhere inside that line, somewhere between strangers and uncertainty, waited the next chapter of their lives. The line crept forward one careful step at a time, not because anyone was impatient, but because every person standing there understood that hope had become something too fragile to rush. Anna kept one hand wrapped around Lucas while the other rested against the empty cloth satchel hanging from her shoulder. It had once carried fresh vegetables home from the Saturday market before the war. Today it carried nothing except the possibility that it might not remain empty much longer. The morning sun climbed higher, warming the broken stone walls that still surrounded the square. Dust floated through narrow beams of light, making the ruined buildings appear almost peaceful from a distance. American trucks remained parked in careful rows while soldiers unloaded wooden crates marked with simple black lettering. Some carried sacks of flour. Others lifted boxes that smelled faintly of canned meat and roasted coffee. The scents drifted across the square like memories from another lifetime. Lucas lifted his head slowly. His small nose twitched. "Mama," he whispered, "I think I smell bread." Anna closed her eyes for a brief moment. She smelled it too. Fresh bread. Real bread. Not the dry substitutes people had stretched with potatoes or whatever grain they could gather. This was the unmistakable aroma of flour, yeast, and warmth. It wrapped itself around the waiting crowd with almost painful gentleness. Several people lowered their heads. One elderly woman quietly wiped tears from her cheeks before anyone could notice. A volunteer standing near the entrance began guiding families forward one at a time. No shouting, no pushing. Everyone would be seen. The order itself felt unfamiliar after years of uncertainty. Anna counted each family ahead of her without realizing she was doing it. 9, then 8, then 7. Lucas leaned gently against her side, growing quieter with every passing minute. His legs no longer had the strength to shift from one foot to the other. Finally, only one family remained before them. An American soldier stood behind a folding wooden table, carefully handing supplies to each civilian. He appeared to be around 30 years old, broad-shouldered without looking imposing, his brown hair neatly trimmed beneath his field cap. His uniform carried the dust of long roads, yet every movement remained calm and deliberate. Before giving each family their provisions, he looked directly into their faces as though he believed every person deserved to be seen before they were served. A small silver cross hung beneath the collar of his jacket, barely visible whenever the breeze caught the fabric. A faded name patch rested above his pocket. Walker. Staff Sergeant Thomas Walker. When the family ahead stepped away with 2 paper sacks, Anna found herself standing before the table. Words that had seemed simple while waiting suddenly became impossible to speak. She looked at Lucas instead. His eyes remained fixed on the loaf resting beside the supply crate. Thomas noticed the child first. Then he looked at Anna. Neither of them spoke for several long seconds. Around them, the sounds of boots, engines, and quiet conversations slowly faded into the background. Finally, Anna gathered every ounce of courage she still possessed. Her English came slowly, softened by exhaustion and a heavy German accent. "Please, 1 piece of bread, for my son." She lowered her eyes immediately after speaking, ashamed that those 7 words were all she had left to offer the world. Thomas did not answer right away. Instead, he looked from the little boy to the nearly empty satchel hanging from Anna's shoulder, then back to her face. There was no anger in his expression, no suspicion, only a long silence that seemed to carry far more weight than any spoken reply. Thomas Walker had witnessed many faces since arriving in Germany. Faces hardened by exhaustion. Faces guarded by fear. Faces that revealed nothing because survival had taught them not to expect kindness. But the woman standing before him carried something different. She was not asking for herself. Every word she had spoken had pointed toward the little boy whose fingers barely reached around her hand. Thomas lowered his eyes to the child. Lucas stood with remarkable stillness, his pale face framed by hair that had not seen proper care in months. The boy never reached for the loaf of bread resting on the table. He did not beg. He did not cry. He simply looked at it with the quiet patience of someone who had forgotten what it meant to expect good news. Thomas had seen that expression once before, although nearly 15 years had passed. Suddenly, he was no longer standing in a ruined German square. He was back on his family's small wheat farm outside Wichita, Kansas, during the hardest years of the Great Depression. He remembered standing beside his own mother while she quietly divided a single loaf into pieces small enough for every family member. She always insisted she had already eaten. Only years later did he understand that she had simply wanted her children to have enough. Some memories never faded. They simply waited for the right face to awaken them. He looked again at Anna. Her coat sleeves had been carefully stitched several times with different shades of thread. One button had been replaced by a piece of smooth wood carved into a rough circle. Someone who repaired clothing instead of replacing it had learned not to waste anything. Even now, she stood perfectly straight despite obvious exhaustion, refusing to let desperation erase her dignity. Thomas slowly reached for the loaf resting beside the crate. Anna held her breath. She expected him to cut a single slice, perhaps 2 if fortune smiled upon them. Instead, Thomas lifted the entire loaf and placed it gently into her empty satchel. Anna blinked in disbelief. Before she could find words, Thomas reached behind him again. One by one, he added a can of corned beef, powdered milk, dried beans, a small bag of flour, 2 apples, and a wrapped bar of chocolate from his own field ration. The chocolate paused in his hand for only a second before he smiled quietly and placed it on top. Lucas stared at the growing pile without moving. His eyes widened with innocent confusion, as though he could not understand why anyone would give away so much. Anna instinctively raised both hands. "No," she whispered softly. "It is too much." Thomas finally spoke, his voice calm and steady. "It is enough." The simple words settled over the space between them. They carried no pity and no sense of charity. They sounded like a statement of simple truth. Anna felt tears gathering despite every effort to remain composed. She pressed her lips together, determined not to break in front of strangers. Thomas reached beneath the table one final time and unfolded a thick olive-green army blanket. He placed it across Lucas's small shoulders with careful hands, adjusting it as though wrapping his own younger brother against a winter wind. The boy looked up into the soldier's face for the first time. "Thank you," he said in careful English, pronouncing each word slowly. Thomas smiled, the first genuine smile he had worn all morning. Around them the line had grown unusually quiet. Civilians waiting their turn watched without speaking. Several American soldiers unloading nearby had paused for a brief moment before returning to their work. No orders had been given. No speeches had been made. Yet in the middle of a city still learning how to breathe again after war, one quiet act of compassion reminded everyone watching that sometimes the smallest gifts carried enough weight to restore something far greater than an empty stomach. Anna remained frozen beside the table long after her satchel had grown heavy enough to pull against her shoulder. For a brief moment she forgot where she was. The voices around her became distant, softened by the steady rhythm of her own heartbeat. She looked down at the loaf resting on top of the flour, then at the chocolate carefully tucked beside the apples. None of it felt real. Hunger had taught her to expect less with every passing day. Yet somehow she had been given more than she had dared imagine. She reached into the satchel and gently lifted the loaf with both hands. It was still slightly warm. The crust crackled faintly beneath her fingertips. She closed her eyes as the familiar aroma drifted upward. Flour, yeast, fresh bread. The scent carried her backward through years untouched by war. She could almost see her mother's tiny kitchen where loaves cooled beside an open window while laughter floated in from the garden. For one impossible second, the world felt ordinary again. Lucas leaned against her arm, staring at the bread with quiet wonder. "Mama," he whispered, "can we eat it now?" Anna smiled through tears that she could no longer hold back. "Yes," she answered softly. "We can." She carefully broke off a small piece and placed it into his hands. The boy held it as though it were something precious enough to break if he squeezed too tightly. He took one cautious bite, then another. His eyes slowly widened. He closed them for a moment, chewing slowly instead of rushing. Children usually devoured food after going hungry, but Lucas seemed determined to remember every taste. Anna watched him with a tenderness that nearly overwhelmed her. She broke off a much smaller piece for herself. It would have been easy to eat more. Every part of her body begged for it. Instead, she wrapped the remaining loaf inside a clean cloth from her satchel before placing it safely back among the supplies. Thomas noticed the gesture. "You should eat," he said gently. Anna nodded with quiet gratitude. "We will. But tomorrow is coming too." Thomas understood immediately. His own mother had once hidden half a pie after Thanksgiving because she believed tomorrow deserved kindness as much as today. Some lessons belong to every family, regardless of language or country. Before Anna stepped away, she carefully reached into the satchel once more. She removed the chocolate bar and held it toward Lucas. The little boy looked at it, then looked across the square where another child, perhaps 6 years old, sat beside his grandmother watching the relief line with tired eyes. Without a word, Lucas walked over and broke the chocolate into 2 uneven pieces. He handed the larger piece to the other child before returning to his mother's side, with the smaller one still resting in his palm. Thomas watched the exchange without speaking. The smile that crossed his face carried both surprise and admiration. Compassion, he realized, could multiply far more quickly than supplies. One generous act had quietly become 2. Nearby, another American soldier noticed what had happened. He opened one of his own field ration packs and placed several packets of crackers onto the table without saying a word. A second soldier followed by adding canned peaches. Within minutes, small gifts began appearing from different corners of the relief station. No orders had been given. No officer had instructed anyone to do more. It simply happened. Kindness moved through the square with the same quiet certainty as morning sunlight spreading across broken stone. As Anna adjusted the blanket around Lucas and prepared to leave, she turned toward Thomas one final time. She searched for words strong enough to express what filled her heart, but every sentence seemed too small. In the end, she simply placed her hand over her heart, bowed her head with quiet dignity, and whispered, "You gave my son more than food today. You gave him a reason to believe tomorrow will come." The walk home felt shorter than it had that morning, although the distance through the damaged streets had not changed. Anna carried the satchel close against her side, while Lucas walked beneath the oversized army blanket draped around his shoulders like a tiny traveling cloak. Every few steps he looked up at his mother with the quiet smile of a child whose world had become just a little safer. The city still bore every scar the war had left behind. Roofless homes stood open to the sky. Empty window frames welcomed only wind. Yet something had changed inside Anna. The streets no longer seemed completely abandoned. Hope had returned so quietly that she almost missed its arrival. Their apartment occupied the second floor of a building that had somehow remained standing despite losing half its roof. Rain still found its way through cracked beams whenever storms crossed the valley, but one room remained dry enough to sleep in. Anna unlocked the worn wooden door and set the satchel carefully onto the small kitchen table. Lucas climbed onto a chair and watched silently as she unpacked every item one by one. The loaf rested in the center like the greatest treasure either of them had ever owned. The flour followed, then the dried beans, the powdered milk, the apples. The blanket folded neatly beside them. Finally, the empty satchel lay flat for the first time in months, no longer carrying disappointment home from another hopeless search. Anna opened the cupboard. It contained only a single chipped bowl, 2 tin cups, and one small cooking pot. It was enough. She poured a little flour into the bowl, mixed it carefully with water, and stirred until the thin paste could become a simple soup. She added a handful of beans to soak for tomorrow. Nothing would be wasted. Every crumb would have a purpose. Lucas sat quietly, watching every movement. "Will we have enough for tomorrow?" he asked. Anna looked toward the loaf before smiling gently. "Yes," she answered, "and perhaps even the day after." The words sounded almost unbelievable as they left her lips. That evening, a soft knock echoed through the hallway outside their apartment. Anna opened the door to find Mrs. Vogel, the elderly widow from downstairs, standing with folded hands and tired eyes. The older woman had helped watch Lucas several times during the hardest weeks of winter, asking nothing in return except conversation when loneliness became too heavy. Her face brightened when she smelled fresh bread drifting through the doorway. Anna did not hesitate. She carried the loaf to the table, cut 2 generous slices, and wrapped them inside a clean cloth before placing them into the older woman's hands. Mrs. Vogel looked startled. "You need this more than I do," she whispered. Anna gently shook her head. "Today someone reminded me that bread grows lighter when it is shared." The widow lowered her eyes, overcome by quiet gratitude, and disappeared back into the hallway with tears glistening beneath the afternoon light. Later, as the evening settled over the broken rooftops, Lucas climbed onto the windowsill wrapped inside the green blanket. He watched birds circle above the city while nibbling the last bite of his slice. "Mama," he asked softly, "do you think that soldier has a little boy too?" Anna looked toward the fading sunlight resting across the distant square where the relief station still operated. She remembered the way Thomas had adjusted the blanket around Lucas without hesitation, the calm patience in his voice, and the kindness that had asked for nothing in return. "I do not know," she answered honestly, "but I think someone once loved him enough to teach him how to care for strangers." Outside, church bells rang once again across the quiet city. This time they no longer sounded like echoes from a forgotten world. They sounded like a promise that ordinary goodness could survive extraordinary hardship, and that sometimes the smallest gift carried home from a stranger became the first brick laid in rebuilding an entire life. The next morning arrived with clear skies and cool spring air drifting through the cracked window above Anna's kitchen table. For the first time in many months, breakfast was more than a memory. The soup she had prepared the evening before simmered gently in the small pot, while 2 thin slices of bread rested beside 2 tin cups filled with warm water. Lucas smiled before taking his seat. He no longer stared at the food with disbelief. Instead, he whispered a quiet thank you before eating, a habit his grandmother had taught him long before the world had changed. Anna watched him carefully. A little color had returned to his cheeks overnight. It was only the smallest difference, but to a mother, small differences often meant everything. After breakfast, she folded the army blanket with great care, placing it beside the window where the morning sunlight could dry away the dampness collected during the night. Her eyes paused on the neatly folded wool for a long moment. It was more than a blanket now. It had become a reminder that complete strangers sometimes carried unexpected warmth into the coldest seasons of life. Later that afternoon, Anna returned to the relief station carrying a small notebook tucked beneath her arm. She was not there to ask for more food. She had come because she had noticed a handwritten sign posted near the entrance asking whether anyone could read both German and English well enough to help families complete registration forms for housing, medical care, and food distribution. Before the war, Anna had worked as the assistant librarian at the city library. Books had been her world. She had cataloged history, organized children's reading circles every Saturday morning, and helped elderly neighbors find novels they had loved in their youth. Words had always felt like bridges connecting people who might otherwise remain strangers. She stepped quietly toward the registration table, where Thomas was sorting stacks of paperwork beneath the afternoon sun. He looked up with gentle surprise. "Mrs. Keller," he said with a warm smile, remembering her name from the previous day. Anna nodded politely. "I came to ask if you still need help." Thomas glanced at the notebook in her hands. "You speak English better than most." Anna smiled faintly. "Books teach many languages." Thomas handed her one of the forms. "Can you explain this to the families waiting over there?" Anna studied the page for only a moment before walking toward an elderly couple struggling to understand the instructions. She knelt beside them, speaking softly in German before pointing to each section one by one. Within minutes, the forms were complete. The couple smiled with visible relief before moving to the next table. Throughout the afternoon, she helped another family, then another, then another. Mothers carrying babies, elderly men searching for missing relatives, teenagers trying to register younger brothers and sisters after losing contact with their parents. Anna never hurried anyone. She listened carefully before translating every question with patience and quiet dignity. Thomas watched from across the station while organizing incoming supplies. What surprised him most was not her ability to translate. It was the calmness she offered every frightened stranger who approached her table. People arrived carrying confusion. They walked away carrying clarity. Near sunset, one of the American officers stopped beside Thomas. "Where did you find your interpreter?" he asked. Thomas looked toward Anna, who was gently helping a little girl write her own name across the top of a registration card. "She found us," he answered. The officer nodded thoughtfully before continuing his rounds. As the final families departed, Anna carefully closed her notebook and returned the remaining forms to Thomas. The square had grown quiet again, touched by the golden light of evening. Thomas looked at the nearly empty stack of paperwork and then back at Anna. "You helped more people today than you know," he said sincerely. Anna lowered her eyes for a moment before answering. "Yesterday someone fed my son. Today I simply tried to feed hope in another way." Thomas stood silently as her words settled into the evening air. In that moment, he realized that compassion did not always arrive inside a supply crate. Sometimes it arrived carrying a notebook, speaking gently, reminding broken people that even after history had divided them, kindness could still become a language everyone understood. Days settled into a gentle rhythm that no one could have imagined only weeks earlier. Every morning, the relief station opened as the church bell echoed across the battered city. Families gathered before sunrise, not because they feared supplies would disappear, but because they had learned that order had replaced uncertainty. Anna arrived carrying the same notebook beneath her arm, while Lucas walked proudly beside her with the green army blanket folded neatly over one shoulder. The blanket had become lighter with every passing day, not because its weight had changed, but because the burden it represented had slowly given way to gratitude. Thomas noticed another change as well. The faces waiting in line no longer remained fixed on the food alone. People greeted one another. Children exchanged shy smiles. Elderly neighbors held places in line for those who struggled to walk. Small gestures, almost invisible at first, quietly spread through the square like sunlight reaching places that had remained in shadow for too long. One afternoon, a truck arrived carrying crates of books donated by a nearby American military school. Most of the soldiers passed by without giving them much attention. Food came first. Medicine came first. Blankets came first. Yet Thomas noticed Anna pause beside the weathered wooden crates. She carefully lifted one worn storybook from the top. The cover had faded, but its pages remained intact. She smiled with the unmistakable expression of someone greeting an old friend. "You miss books," Thomas observed. Anna nodded gently. Books remind people who they were before difficult times tried to define them. Later that day, while families waited for paperwork to be processed, Anna gathered several children beneath the shade of a damaged oak tree standing near the edge of the square. Some sat on overturned wooden boxes. Others simply rested on the grass. Lucas found a place in the front, hugging his knees with quiet excitement. Anna opened the storybook and began reading first in English, then in German, translating each page with calm patience so every child could follow the adventure together. Laughter slowly replaced silence. Curious questions replaced frightened whispers. Even the adults waiting nearby found themselves listening. Thomas paused while carrying supply boxes, surprised by how naturally both languages flowed together without conflict. The children did not care which language came first. They only cared about the story. An older American sergeant stopped beside Thomas and listened for several minutes before smiling. "Funny thing," he said quietly. "Those kids are forgetting which side anyone came from." Thomas looked toward the circle beneath the tree. A German boy had leaned closer to see the illustrations while an American medic sat nearby, repairing a little girl's broken doll with thread from his sewing kit. No one seemed to notice how extraordinary the scene would have appeared only months earlier. "Maybe children remember something adults spend too much time forgetting," Thomas replied. As the reading ended, Lucas carefully collected the books and handed one to another little boy who had admitted he had never owned a storybook before. "You can read this tomorrow," Lucas said. "Then you can tell me your favorite part." Anna watched her son with quiet pride. Hunger had nearly stolen his childhood, yet kindness had somehow protected his generosity. Before leaving for the evening, Thomas walked beside Anna as they crossed the square beneath the golden light of sunset. He looked toward the growing circle of families still talking peacefully outside the relief station. "When I first arrived," he admitted, "I thought we were rebuilding streets." Anna followed his gaze toward the children still laughing beneath the old oak tree. "Streets matter," she answered softly. "But people must find one another again before a city truly comes back to life." Thomas nodded without speaking. Looking across the square, he realized the strongest foundation they had laid was not made of stone, timber, or brick. It had been built quietly, one conversation, one shared meal, one story, and one act of unexpected compassion at a time. By early summer, the square no longer looked like a place waiting to survive. Flower boxes appeared beneath repaired windows. Children played between piles of neatly stacked bricks, while carpenters measured door frames that had stood empty for months. The relief station remained busy, but its purpose had slowly begun to change. Fewer people arrived searching only for food. Many now came asking where they could work, where they could learn a trade again, or where families might rebuild their homes. Hope had stopped feeling like a visitor. It had quietly become part of everyday life. One warm afternoon, Thomas was carrying inventory sheets toward the supply office when his commanding officer called his name. A sealed envelope rested in the captain's hand. Thomas accepted it with a polite nod, already recognizing the familiar format of official army orders. He opened the envelope beneath the shade of the old oak tree and read each line carefully. His unit would be transferred to another occupation district in 72 hours. The assignment was routine, necessary, expected, yet the words felt unexpectedly heavy. He folded the paper neatly and slipped it into his pocket before looking across the square. Anna was helping two elderly sisters complete housing applications while Lucas sat nearby reading one of the donated storybooks aloud to three younger children. The afternoon sunlight rested softly across their faces, and for a brief moment Thomas wished time could remain exactly where it was. News traveled quickly through the relief station. By the following morning, several volunteers had already heard that the American unit would soon depart. They thanked the soldiers with quiet handshakes and simple words that carried more meaning than long speeches ever could. Anna listened without interrupting. She simply nodded once before returning to her work. That evening, after the last family had left the square, she walked home carrying a small cloth bundle beneath her arm. The apartment smelled different now. Flour rested inside a proper storage jar. Fresh herbs grew in a cracked flower pot beside the window. The city bakery had reopened 2 weeks earlier, and its owner had offered Anna several hours of work each morning because he remembered how carefully she treated every customer before the war. She untied the cloth bundle and placed a freshly baked loaf upon the table. Its golden crust reflected the warm glow of a single oil lamp. Lucas looked at it with wide eyes. "Is that for us?" he asked. Anna smiled gently as she brushed a little flour from her sleeve. "We will bake another tomorrow," she answered. "This one belongs to someone else." Early the next afternoon, she carried the loaf through the familiar streets toward the relief station. The bread was still warm beneath the white kitchen towel wrapped around it. She found Thomas standing beside one of the supply trucks checking equipment before departure. He looked up as she approached and immediately noticed what she carried. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Anna carefully unfolded the towel and held out the loaf with both hands. "The first bread I have baked since the war ended," she said quietly. "I wanted the first loaf to belong to the man who reminded my son what kindness tasted like." Thomas looked at the bread without reaching for it immediately. The aroma of fresh wheat drifted between them, carrying with it memories of distant farms, family kitchens, and ordinary mornings that every war seemed determined to steal. Finally, he accepted the loaf with both hands, treating it with the same care Anna had shown weeks earlier when he first placed bread into her empty satchel. "Thank you," he said softly. Anna shook her head with a gentle smile. "No," she replied. "Thank you for believing that feeding one child could help an entire city remember how to care for one another again." Around them, the afternoon breeze stirred the leaves of the old oak tree while children's laughter echoed across the square, sounding less like an ending than the beginning of a future neither of them had dared imagine on the day they first met. 3 mornings later, the convoy rolled slowly through the rebuilt square beneath a sky washed clean by gentle spring rain. Engines hummed softly while townspeople gathered along the roadside, not because anyone had ordered them to come, but because gratitude had quietly become a habit. Children waved from repaired doorsteps. Elderly couples removed their hats as the trucks passed. Several American soldiers smiled through open windows, recognizing faces they had greeted almost every day for months. Thomas sat near the back of the lead truck with the fresh loaf Anna had given him wrapped carefully inside the same white kitchen towel. He had resisted eating it during the journey. Somehow it felt less like food and more like a promise that ordinary life could return, one kitchen at a time. As the convoy approached the edge of town, Lucas suddenly broke free from the small crowd and ran several yards before stopping beside the road. The green army blanket no longer rested across his shoulders. Instead, it had been folded neatly over one arm. He lifted his free hand and waved with all the strength a 5-year-old could gather. Thomas smiled, stepped down from the slow-moving truck for one brief moment, and walked toward the boy. Without saying a word, Lucas held out a small object. It was the silver cross Thomas had noticed hanging beneath his own collar during their first meeting. Except it was not his. Anna had carved it from a simple piece of oak using scraps left by local carpenters. The edges were smooth. The grain of the wood caught the morning light. On the back, burned carefully into the surface, were 6 small words. "Kindness is never wasted." Thomas accepted the little cross with both hands. He looked at Anna standing several feet behind her son. She simply smiled and placed one hand over her heart, the same silent gesture she had offered weeks earlier when words had failed them both. Thomas returned the gesture before climbing back onto the truck. The convoy disappeared beyond the hills, leaving behind only the fading sound of engines and a town that no longer felt forgotten. Years passed. Streets were rebuilt. Schools reopened. The library welcomed readers once again, and Anna returned to the work she had always loved. Every Saturday morning, she organized story hours beneath shelves filled with books that smelled of paper, ink, and possibility. Children gathered around her just as they once had beneath the old oak tree. They listened to stories about courage, forgiveness, and neighbors helping neighbors. She never spoke about herself. She simply believed every generation deserved reasons to trust humanity a little more than fear. Lucas grew into a thoughtful young man with his mother's quiet kindness and the steady patience of the stranger who had once shared his bread. Inspired by the care his family had received during those difficult months, he chose to study medicine. Years later, patients entering his small clinic noticed a simple wooden cross hanging above his desk. Beneath it rested a handwritten sentence framed behind glass. "Kindness is never wasted." Few people asked where it came from. Those who did received the same gentle answer. It reminds me that the smallest act can become the beginning of someone else's future. Across the Atlantic, Thomas eventually returned to his family's farm outside Wichita. Life settled into peaceful routines filled with harvests, church on Sundays, and grandchildren who loved climbing onto his porch swing to hear stories about places they had never seen. Whenever they asked what he had learned during the war, they expected tales of uniforms, trucks, or distant cities. Instead, he always spoke about a mother who accepted help with dignity, a little boy who shared his chocolate before finishing it himself, and a loaf of bread that found its way back into his hands months later. Then he would pause, smile toward the Kansas horizon, and say, "History remembers battles, but the future is usually built by people who quietly choose compassion when no one expects it." And perhaps that is the truest measure of an ordinary life, because the quietest people are often the ones who raise the standard without ever raising their voices.